All right. So, thank you for joining me on this next one. I'm going to go over kind of what we talked about last time before I talk about the new sections. And before then, too, I kind of want to review some ideas. So, the first idea I want to review is the concept of anxiety. As you can see, I wrote it twice by accident. But anxiety for Kierkegaard is basically enabled by freedom and possibility, or as he says, it's freedom's possibility. What this kind of means is that whenever, like, the reason that I feel anxious is because there is a possibility of things to happen. When I graduated high school, I had a, you know, infinite amount of career options to choose from. This anxiety causes dizziness and makes us feel unstable and ungrounded. The difference between fear and anxiety is fear has a direct object. For example, a bear chasing you. That's very direct. Anxiety has no direct object. It more exists in possibility and actuality, or rather than actuality. And if you have ever watched Inside Out 2, they actually stole that directly from Kierkegaard, how anxiety has no direct object. So just keep the concept of anxiety in mind. The other concept I wanted to review was the stages of existence. In many of his works, he talks about three stages. Sometimes there's more depending on the work. But the three basic ones are the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. What these three stages are not like ways that we grow or anything. They're more like stances that we take towards the world and how we see things. So the aesthetic stage is purely hedonistic. It's about pursuing pleasure and running away from pain. It's just maximizing the your finitude. The problem with this is, for example, if I get a pair of new shoes, well, in a few weeks those shoes are no longer new and I have to chase a new pleasure. The aesthetic life is one full of fleeting moments that never last. It's full of, yeah, like that, just fleeting feelings. The ethical stage is not about ethics, but about social morality, more so to speak. It's about what's right and wrong, what society tells us what's right and wrong. People in this stage view life through probably just the most practical way possible. Many Christians view life this way. They just try to do what's right and wrong. The problem with the ethical is that it's socially bound and it's not dependent on something eternal either. Social and cultural customs change depending on society's needs. If I lived in a country where certain ideals force me to be racist or sexist, like whatever, I would still be obliged to follow them in this ethical stage. The third one I won't dive too deep into is religious, which is some sort of combo in between and yet transcends both. We then, now getting back into the book, last time we talked about the self. From Kierkegaard's perspective, the self is a process of becoming. It's not just a static entity, as is commonly assumed, that we are this, at least in historically in philosophy, maybe not nowadays, but it was assumed that there was this like mental substance, like in a Cartesian dualism kind of way. For Kierkegaard, the self is not even generated by itself and it's not static. It's generated by the power that established it. For him, that would be God, but you could say the eternal, the divine, however you want to think of it. This self is made out of also more relationships between the infinite and the finite, or possibility and necessity. Like I am opened by possibility but restrained by my own needs. Stuff like this. And he said that this dialectic needs to be kind of aware of itself and relate to itself and be part of becoming. Because otherwise it's kind of just a Hegelian dialectic that's more abstract and out there. We also talked about the 3 forms of despair. There's the inauthentic despair, unconscious despair. So this type of despair is not knowing you have a self, thinking that you're either just ego or you're just, I don't know, completely external, I would say. The second form of despair is knowing you have a self and not wanting to be yourself. This is the first authentic form of despair. This is people who very desperately just want to be rid of themselves. The third form was the despair of wanting to be yourself, which, without God basically, which is the deepest form of despair for him, because this would be the Sartrean, like, existence precedes essence, I believe it as is the quote, where the whole world is just pure possibility for me to define and rule over. Kierkegaard would see this as the deepest form of despair, also known as the despair of defiance, because if all values are simply made by me, then they become arbitrary, because I can decide one day that that value doesn't matter anymore. They're not grounded in anything. It's just an abyss of possibilities. He talked about later on in the few chapters before how despair is both a merit and ruin, basically meaning it's the part of us that separates us from animals in some way. Despair allows us to have like existential questions and thoughts that, like, you know, a cat probably doesn't have, like worrying about, you know, if God exists or not. It's also ruin though too, because he equates somewhat despair with sin. If someone is in despair, like, that spiritual condition is what allows me to commit a sin like murder. If I'm truly in a state of faith rather than despair, I'm not going to do these horrible things. So he more grounds sin in a state of being rather than just an action. And in the part right before that we're going to talk about, he talks about how despair is basically wanting to be rid of yourself and being unable to. He says, for despair, death isn't the end. It is just a process of experiencing dying. It's being unable to die. This constant, he says, you gnaw at yourself on end, but you cannot get rid of yourself more than a knife can stab away thoughts. So we learn that this sickness unto death, this despair, is this constant gnawing at oneself, trying to get rid of oneself. And this can happen in those 3 different forms. People can think that they're not in despair at all, but be in despair. He says, there's a man who wants to become Caesar. He says, Caesar or nothing. This quote itself means I do not want to be myself. I want to become someone else. I want to be rid of myself. And if he becomes Caesar, he falls deeper into despair because he is not true to himself. He doesn't care about actually becoming himself. If he fails, he's also in despair because he's stuck with this self that he just tried to get rid of, right? And there's a lot of examples like this. So finally, the last pages that we're going to talk about that were for the reading, we're going over a dialectic that was shown at the beginning of the sickness unto death. Right after he says the self is a relation which relates itself to itself. He says that we are a dialectic between, let me find it really quick actually. We are a dialectic between the infinite and the finite, the temporal and the eternal, and of freedom and necessity. So we're going to be talking about these dialectics and how they go out of balance. The first one is the infinite and finite dialectic. So the first two will be too much infinity without finitude and too much finitude without infinity. And then the next two are possibility and necessity. So we'll have possibility without necessity and necessity without possibility. Before I go into that, is there any questions before I get into those dialectics? I'm going to take a sip of water too. Nope. All right. So the first one is, hold on, let me pull this up, is the despair of infinitude, lacking any finitude. This despair occurs when someone becomes lost in the infinite, in abstraction, in ideas. These people are all about fantasy and imagination, but they're stuck there. They never touch anything finite, and everything becomes abstract. Even when they talk about humans, they're only talking about humans. They never actually engage with humanity. They're very romantic, live up in space. Because they lack any finitude, they lack any grounding to the real world. They're kind of just floating away. The reverse of this is finitude without infinitude. This type of person only cares about earthly things. They only see what's in front of them. They never question the meaning of life. They never have these philosophical, abstract ideas. They stick to what they're told to do. And these people are usually like hustlers that are completely unaware of any deeper meaning than simply getting money and doing all of this. They don't care about ideals. They don't care about these other things. So a lot of this part of the book, he criticizes people who just go along with the herd, who don't think for themselves, who just are super successful and yet they're lacking in any spiritual sense. The next two dialectics are possibility and necessity. So possibility is despair without necessity, is a person who imagines many futures. They have many ideas. They have many selves that they try on in their head, but they never do anything with their life. They might imagine themselves becoming a writer, but they never write. They might imagine themselves becoming a philosopher, but they never read. This person is just pure possibilities and is either one, too lost in them, or he goes over another possibility, which he's a person who's so scared of possibilities that they never do anything as well. So a person who gets lost and a person who's scared. The last one is necessity without possibility. He just says, I think it's directly quoted. Yeah, right here. He says, if one wants to compare running astray in possibility with a child's use of vowels, then lacking possibility is like being dumb. He literally just says it's just being dumb. This form of despair, there's no possibility. The person doesn't believe that they can get better. They don't believe anything will ever change. They don't see any future. They live a very scared and banal life. This type of despair is very suffocating to the spirit, to the person, because they never imagine a future. They never try anything new. They just feel... It's basically like a deepest stage of depression. If you've ever talked to someone who's in a very like dark, depressive episode, if you tell them good things like, hey, like, isn't this coming up soon? Like, aren't you excited for this or that? They almost get offended. Like, no, I'm miserable, right? It's because they can't see any possible way out. It's just, it's pure survival, pure necessity. And there's one type of person he calls the determinist or the fatalist. He's like, this person, while they're in this state, they at least still have an imagination. They can still somewhat imagine things. But then there's another person who he calls the petty bourgeois, who live such a mundane and banal life that they don't even realize that they're in this despair. They can't even imagine anything intellectual. They've lost their capacities completely. And those are the last 10 pages of the reading. So that's where we are. Any comments?
I guess for me, maybe the question is that to me, the like finitude and infinitude and necessity and possibility sound pretty much the same. So could you like explain more what the difference is? Like I understand the points they're saying, but also I don't understand the difference between those two dialectics, I guess.
So do you not understand like the difference between infinitude and finitude, or is it more
Like there's
like
finitude and possibility.
possibility? Oh, like
Like
infinity and possibility, how those two are different?
yes, and also like the necessity and finitude. Because again, when I read it, it felt like it's pretty much like similar in the sense of like kind of same.
They're related. So I would say the difference between infinitude and possibility would be infinitude is kind of like your orientation towards the world. If I have like this infinite orientation, I'm going to live in this abstract realm. Possibility is a lot more practical. It's like how much do you let yourself become? If you live in pure possibility, it's like there's these infinite ways of becoming, but you never become because you're just stuck in that. Infinitude is more like the way that you look at. I don't. It's hard to explain because they both are involved with the way you look at things. It's just one's a lot more about the self. The
I guess
Go ahead.
I guess then you could say it one is more mental and another one is more like actional. Like
Yeah, I
mm,
mean the infinitude and finitude ones. Both those people can kind of act in whatever way they want in the world. It's more of that possibility and necessity is how the self becomes. So possibility is what lets your he says like it's what lets your spirit breathe, but it needs necessity to make it actionable. The infinitude is more just like maybe my almost like a philosophical stance. Like I like abstract things. I like systems. Finitude would be all about people, but to like an extreme, just following their footsteps, never doing anything, never thinking for yourself. I don't know if that makes any
okay,
sense.
I think I kind of got it. I would not be able to explain it, but I think I get the point.
Yeah, one's a bit more grounded in the self, I would say, and one's more grounded in like the the lens which you view the world.
Yeah, I think I got it.
Okay. Anyone else find something interesting? Anything stick out to you? Maybe you know a person that falls into these categories.
Does he offer a solution uh, for despair?
Yeah, it's going to be faith. Give putting your So he's a very relational thinker. The reason we fall into despair is because the way that we relate to the world is out of line.
Oh,
If
right.
I only relate to the world, for example, like towards my job, well, what happens when I lose my job, right? I fall into despair. His argument would be you've always been in despair because you grounded yourself in a relationship that isn't eternal. So the solution is going to be grounding yourself in something eternal, in something that doesn't just pass away at some point. Because like even if I write a book, people could read it for 1,000 years, but eventually it's going to pass away. So the only way out of despair for him is faith, which means to ground your being in something eternal. or be in relationship with the eternal. But we're not going to get like into the full solutions until later. Like after this too, he starts to talk about, yeah, the levels of consciousness that despair rises into. He doesn't really give too big of a solution till the end. At the beginning, he kind of talks about it. He's like, the self must be grounded in the power that established it. It couldn't have established itself because then certain forms of despair wouldn't even be possible in his mind. Yeah. It says, this is then the formula which describes the state of the self when despair is completely eradicated. In relating to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. This whole first 2 pages is basically the thesis of the whole book. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah.
Maybe you guys too have questions about like certain things I brought up in the slides, like about anxiety or the stages of existence. These are my intro
This
slides.
is not. This is not like a question, but it's just like how. Like I think it's a really good description of anxiety. Like I feel like to a certain degree psychologists should read it.
Well, he coined the term angst, which basically gave us the idea of like existential anxiety. He kind of like before we would read anxiety almost equate it to fear, but because of Kierkegaard's book literally called The Concept of Anxiety, we now view anxiety much differently. He is very influential on psychology. Like very influential.
Yeah, I think like as someone who experiences anxiety, not like social anxiety, but like just anxiety, I think it's a really good description of like how it feels like or why it happens.
Yeah.
Because like I personally like just feel like I would say it's like fear. It's more like something being overwhelming because there's so much going on. Like there's so, like as I said, there's like so many possibilities what to do that it just paralyzes you, and you're not being able to do anything, which is the necessity.
Yeah,
So like
keep going.
so like this is maybe why I don't have as many questions for these 10 pages, because I felt like it's really like through my own experiences it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I had certain people in mind when I read these different descriptions, like someone who's lost in the infinite. It's like this person never does anything in reality. They just have these beautiful like values, but don't even practice them. I see people in like every one of these, and I see myself in a few of these as well. The last form with necessity without possibility is like the scariest one to me, because it's like that's when you can't even imagine any future. You can't even imagine yourself developing. It's just suffocating.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to like, I think it's more like finitude with infinitude. Like, I think it's something me and my mom talked about a lot when it comes to people who liked USSR, in the sense of like who missed that time, is because a lot of people don't know how to think for themselves or what they want to do. So they liked USSR because pretty much everything was told to you what to do, what you have to do. You didn't have to think, you just had to do it. And the people who like don't know how to think for themselves preferred USSR because they didn't have to think. While the people who were maybe more like wanted to choose for themselves what they want to do prefer the country how it is now. versus how it was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of infinitude would be like, I can't even think of any values. I just simply live in the external
Yeah,
world what it tells me to do. So,
yeah, like I don't know. I just like how it can explain certain mindsets people have.
yeah, Kierkegaard is super psychological. He also wrote that partly as an attack on the church as well. That was part of the reason you'll actually see jabs that he takes at the church if you read through it. So, where was kind of wanted to pull up the concept of anxiety too. Concept of Anxiety is a really good book as well, but it's very poorly written to the point where he admitted it was like one of his worst written books. It's kind of the precursor to despair because, for example, possibility doesn't exist without anxiety. He thinks anxiety and possibility are tied together. Same with like infinitude. Because, if anxiety is about freedom's possibility, then to be educated in anxiety, he says, is to be in faith, which is, opposite of despair in his words. I was trying to find. Let's see. I think it's right here. Anxiety may be compared with dizziness. He whose eye happens to look down in the yawning abyss becomes dizzy. But for what reason is this? Is it just as much his own eyes as in the abyss? Like, he also kind of talks about, too, it is like staring down into an abyss and realizing that you could jump in. Like, that's a possibility. That's a lot related to anxiety, too. Like, when you're driving, you could just crash. It's fully in your hands. That's when anxiety starts to come up as well. Anxiety is most selfish. I think he calls it a sympathetic antipathy and antipathetic sympathy, meaning when I look at the edge, I both don't want to jump and I want to jump at the same time. I think is basically what that means. There's like a little part of you that's like, wow, I could actually do it, and I almost want to, and that like scares you. Um, but yeah, that's more about the anxiety part. Oops.
Honestly, like I'm really glad I decided to take part of this book club because I feel like I could use some information from here in my like psychology exams, like when it comes to the interview part.
Yeah, read The Sickness Unto Death and The Concept of Anxiety, and you'll have a lot of things to talk about.
Yeah, because I remember last year I kind of fumbled the interview because I couldn't bring out like sources. So now it's like, oh my god, I'm so smart. I have read The Sickness Unto Death. This is a joke, but
Hey, having a philosophical like approach to things sometimes doesn't hurt, especially if you're not doing something that's like immediately practical, like doing a diagnosis. Like this is more kind of knowing why you're doing something. I feel like it gives you a sense of purpose too. There's like a eternal calling that he gives people, especially with anxiety. It's like become educated in anxiety and you can conquer like despair and all these things.
I feel like it would be more useful when it comes to therapy rather than like diagnostics. Like,
Well, for me, it was highly therapeutic, so I don't disagree. I was definitely the dialectic between possibility and necessity. I was deep into the possibility. I always had ideas, and I never brought anything into fruition. So this book club is kind of part of me trying to lean into necessity more.
Like I guess I used to be the same. The whole like there's so many possibilities, but I'm not doing anything to actually do it.
Yeah. Well, and too, as a Christian, he takes mental health pretty seriously, um, especially for the time too. People, a lot of the diagnosis Christians give will just be like, "Hey, just pray more, just like believe harder." Like,
I mean, I feel like they did it even with terminal illness.
yeah, just pray harder. It's like at least Kierkegaard takes these problems seriously. He doesn't just like sweep anxiety under the rug or despair, pretend it doesn't exist. He actually says it's needed to even be a Christian. You can't just live this comfortable life where you don't ever have to question anything. He challenges people to become themselves, to strive to be better, to be the person that they were meant to be. I think too what helps me a lot is his relational view of the world, because depending on how I relate to the world, that changes how I feel about things. If I see rainy days as sad, well, that just is going to make those days sad for no reason. If I see rainy days as like a symbol of renewal, then those days are transformed. My relationship with the world deeply matters.
Yeah, I feel like it also explains the cultural differences.
Yeah, for sure.
Like this is a weird thing to say, like with maybe example, but for example, in Estonia, um, spiders are shown as good luck in the house. Like you shouldn't kill a spider or it will bring bad luck. So many people, like I will say that here, fear of spiders is less common, while in countries where maybe like the spiders are also more dangerous, um, it's seen as necessity to kill them pretty much.
Right. No, that makes total sense. You can apply his relational view to everything because in his I mean, I totally agree with him that everything is relational. I'm not like this separated, static individual from everyone else. Every time someone even talks to me, it changes the shape of myself. It progresses me in who I'm becoming. I mean, certain ways I learned to cook, that was because of someone else, and that forever shaped me. The relational worldview, I think, is very important, and people miss out on it. They usually focus on the self only, rather than how we relate to others.
I think it can also, like this kind of worldview can help with understanding other people, even if you don't agree with them. It can kind of like um, make you understand why they act certain way.
Oh, for sure. I mean, yes, something as simple as a phobia, it's like that's how they relate to that thing. Or even their childhood, the relationship that they had with their parents deeply matters, right? That changes someone drastically. Because I have my certain mental illnesses, my whole brain even just relates to the world differently. It orients itself in a different way. And he does make this very beautiful too, because he still believes in like, I don't know if they're static, but they're like these universals, like let's say kindness. Like kindness is kindness. It is what it is, but because of our relationship to the world, we express it differently. I might express it through getting my degree in psychology and helping people that way. Someone else might express kindness in like giving to the poor. Um, but we all relate to these universal values like kindness differently, although we're still expressing like a universal of what it means to be a human being, just in our own unique way.
Oh, can you touch a bit more on the fatalist? It be it seems like there's only one possibility, or what?
What was that? The fatalist?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was talking about in that section having basically only necessity without possibility.
Uh,
Um, where is it? It's like 75, 70s. He mentions the fatalist. Fatalist is in despair. He has lost his self because everything for him is necessity. He is like a king who starved to death because all his food turned to gold. Personhood is a sin. He doesn't really like fully define these words. I have a feeling too he's kind of using them in a very maybe not in the way that they're traditionally used. I would say he's using determinists like I feel like I have no control over my life type of thing.
mhm.
Do you know what I mean? Because I think he's talking about the self. He's not talking about like the metaphysical state of the universe, whether there's free will or not. So you're gonna be like, you're gonna say everything's determined already. This is just my fate because everything's necessity. There's no more possibility. All possibility has been cut out. It's like the self cannot breathe. It's impossible to breathe on necessity alone. The fatalist is in despair. He has lost God and thereby his self. For a person who has no God has no self either. God is necessity. Yeah, I mean, he's just describing what a fatalist Christian would look like too. They would just be faking everything because they don't believe that God can do anything. It's a very like deist view of God too. But do you have a more like direct question about it? Or was that kind of answer it?
When you said determinist, it's like I have like a destiny and all the
Are you
I don't
asking
know.
me to define determinism?
No, I mean like um, a fatalist has no possibilities, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Should I zoom in a little more?
But what does he dream of, like, or imagine,
He imagines well, wait. Are you talking about a certain sentence
or
here?
like I heard you say, at least a fatalist can imagine um a
S-
possibility or something.
So the fatalist still has like an intellectual capability. They can still imagine a self. They can still imagine the existential dimension, but the only thing they can imagine about that dimension is that everything's already determined. So they're still aware that they have a self. The other version is not being aware you have a self. This person just is completely mundane and suffocated. They can't even imagine something like determinism because they're so stuck, I guess. He kind of he barely goes into it towards the end. Pretty bourgeois vulgarity places in commonplace. Despair as much as it seems like the petty bourgeois compared to the fatalist is kind of like they don't realize they have a dialectic while the fatalist realizes they have this dialectic. Because I think he says too, the fatalists are determinists. They still beg for possibility to happen. They just don't see how it could happen. The petty bourgeois just doesn't even realize possibility exists, pretty much. They kind of live life on autopilot. Um, Let me go go back to my slides. I think too, one of the important things to realize, which I've mentioned before about Kierkegaard, is when he's giving these definitions, he's not trying to just build a philosophical system. He's very against people who think that they can systematize the human experience. It was from a C. Stephen Evans book. C. Stephen Evans is a scholar on Kierkegaard. He's like, for Kierkegaard, existence is not a concept. Like, anxiety isn't just a concept. So, like, when we talk about this stuff, you gotta realize this is completely real. And I can define it in many different ways, but I'm never going to capture it. I can simply, like, point towards it. It's kind of the same with despair. He's giving examples of people in despair, a person who just follows along with the herd, but these are real experiences. They're not just philosophical questions, I guess, or structures. He's very much about existence, and this is like where paradox comes in. Like, if we define happiness in essence, it's very easy to separate happiness from sadness, like by definition. But when you're going throughout your day, like, you can be both happy and sad, right? Your subjective truth can contain paradox. It can contain both of these at once. So when we're going over this, like, these different dialectics within the human being, like, freedom and necessity are two things that are definitionally different, but in existence they exist, like, at the same time within us. So paradox for Kierkegaard is very, very important. It's kind of what allows us to be a human being. You know, I think he gives examples of, like, how laughter is very close to tears, or to be strong is to be vulnerable. There's a lot of... He's focusing more on existence than I would say essence. It's just something to kind of keep in mind when we're learning about these different things. Honestly, if you guys don't have any more comments, I think I covered quite a lot of ground, so...
Yeah, I think this one is the most, like, comprehensible. Not, it's not about how you presented it, just the chapters were the most, like, were a bit of an easier read than the last one.
Well, in a lot less pages. I cut 2/3 of our reading down. And part of this is actually a review from last time, so... I realize I just put way too much reading. I always forget how difficult Kierkegaard is to read because I obsessively read him. So I added too much reading last time. But I'm glad I explained this more clearly.
Yeah, it was really good.
Oh, thank you. I've been thinking about for a while, I'm like, how do I just explain this in the simplest way possible? And I decided to just kind of go in order of ideas so that they build on top of each other. Because you can see, hopefully, how the definition of the self from page 1 matters, because the self is a relation. So we're going to talk about the relationship between infinitude and finitude, right? It all builds on top of each other.
Yeah, it works really well.
And I think he structured the book really well. He really does have the ideas slowly build up. The next reading is going to be how becoming more aware of your despair, like, kind of changes its quality. He thinks too, like, the more someone's in despair, the more close they are to God, in a sense, because they're so aware of these things. It's not, like, required to be in despair for him to, like, believe in something, but it kind of shows that there's an existential depth to you that you're at least grappling with, even if you're doing it incorrectly, even if you're doing it in a way that hurts you. At least you're grappling with yourself and you're trying to become, right? So the next ones are just going to be the levels of consciousness of despair. And also, it looks like we're going to get into like paganism and different beliefs as well. He's going to talk later on too about how actually he doesn't even think pagans can have like a demonic form of sin. He thinks only Christians can be like demonic or Luciferian, pretty much. Because he sees like, oh, if you're aware of these things, then you know how to hurt people more. Then you know how to do worse things. He doesn't think the pagan is as, it's kind of an insult a bit, as spiritually deep, but at the same time, he thinks Christians do the worst and most damage to people.
I mean, looking at history.
Right. Because the idea is the more spiritually deep you are, the further you can fall. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but like, when people, for example, like torture people, it actually takes empathy because you have to understand how to hurt someone. You have to see things through their eyes to be able to do something like that. So it's kind of like this deepening spirituality makes you more likely to be able to do horrible things or, you know, rise above it. But that will be the next time reading. I think I'll just end the recording here.